Hey guys, what is up? AwesomeTheSauce here. Hope you guys are having a great day and welcome to a crazy test ROM update video. Yesterday, after I uploaded my video, like literally an hour after, they put out a bunch of big updates, so I'm going to be covering a lot of them over the next couple of days. The thing I really wanted to talk about today is they removed Solar Surge completely from PvP. So in test ROM right now, if you want to use Solar Surge, you're out of luck. If you put it in your deck, if you have a deck like this, you will never see a Solar Surge if you hop into queue. This will not show up. Now, obviously, this changes everything, so I wanted to make a video talking about the effects that this has on the meta, and honestly, it's not just like it's not a small change. It's gonna affect a lot of schools. It's gonna affect them in a lot of different ways. Let's talk about the one thing that I really think I like the most out of everything related to this change, and it's just the fact that offensive schools just become more offensive. And I mean, the reasoning here is really, really simple. I mean, it just, if you look at a 4-pip spell, right, like Brimstone, for example, right, and compare it to another similar spell for another defensive school like Luminous, for example, the percentage of damage that you lose on Brimstone by not being able to Solar Surge enchant it is smaller than it is for life with Luminous. And the main reason is just because you have higher damage on your spells when you're a fire wizard versus a life wizard. And what I really, really like about that is that a lot of defensive schools have like spells that hit and then do something defensive as well added onto it. And those kinds of spells are very, very spammable. I'm talking about Luminous, I'm talking about Obsidian Colossus, I'm talking about the new Evil Snowman. Those were hella spammable and they would do tons of damage for no reason. I think removing this removes the fact that Luminous can do 600 plus damage with a weakness base. Like, that's nuts for a school that can also heal. So in a lot of ways, the more offensive schools, they can actually fall back on their naturally higher damage, and it actually helps them a lot. So I think that's one really, really nice thing. It's also worth mentioning that spells that got an extra buff with Solar Surge, like Drains, like Wraith, for example, which, I mean, literally, before this, you could just Shrike and Wraith 3 times, and I don't think you could actually find a way to lose on a death. Spells like this are now actually balanced, I would say. Like, it actually makes sense. Like, you could still use this, especially when you have buffs, especially if you have things like Bubble Control, but it's not always a good move if someone happens to hit you, because if they hit you with a good spell, your Drain might not actually do that much. Every time someone Solar Surged a Wraith that did 500 damage, right? Well, if we're looking at the base version of it, every single time they did that, they were not getting a 300 enchant. You get half of that in Drain as well. It's almost like a 450 enchant, and the only reason that's not exactly true is because your opponent could have high death resist or something, and in that way, you know, Drains might not be as good. But if you're going against someone who has normal resist, as in they're not set for your school, this was a spell that had a 450 damage enchant with the Solar Surge. So now, schools like Death, Life, Balance, and Ice are gonna have to try a little bit harder to do the same amount of damage as Fire and Storm, and that's not a bad thing at all. That actually makes sense, right? These are schools with higher HP, generally higher resist, generally more defensive utility options. It makes a lot of sense that they're also not able to do the same amount of damage, along with the things that make their schools good, like draining, healing, shielding, all that, you know? So this is a really, really good thing in that way. Like, I think the Solar Surge change actually makes spells very, very balanced for a lot of schools. Now, let's talk about what I think are some fundamental flaws with removing Solar Surge. Obviously, this, as I said, removing Solar Surge changes everything, so I feel like there's a lot of things to talk about here. One big thing is that now Satyr is just like, honestly, not just Satyr, I'm just using Satyr as an example. Any heal, in my opinion, right now, is extremely, extremely overpowered, because unless you get one-shotted, you are absolutely able to out-heal everything. You don't even have to use any of this new gear. All you really have to do is run, like, honestly, any gear that gives good healing and high resist, and you absolutely don't have to worry anymore. I mean, yes, Life got a big nerf in the fact that their Luminous now only does 370 damage instead of 670, but in every other way, Life had Life last night. Every time that I went against Life or saw how Life could play, the game plan is just very simple, right? Infections don't work as well anymore because you could have always used this. You also just have Imp, which hits and then does an overtime heal, so you're never really worried about infections in the same way. Honestly, you could literally just hit and heal spam in test ROM and throw in a couple of Satyrs, and it's very, very hard without damage enchants to keep keep up with it. I don't think this is like a hard point to understand. This game has existed with damage enchant since almost the beginning, and Sador's been like this since almost the beginning. I feel like the reason why, especially for PvP and for balancing reasons in general, the reason why the spell hasn't been changed is mainly because damage enchants always made this somewhat of like, you know, a balanced spell. But right now, you could just heal over and over again, and you do not even have to worry about timer, because like it's not a problem. You just heal, and then you just slowly break down your opponent. In concept, that's fine, but the way you can out heal a Shad is very concerning. So I hope that they do something about this. It doesn't have to be an incoming and outgoing nerf. It doesn't have to be a healing per pip nerf, but I think it has to be something along those lines. Either damage needs to be higher to deal with healing, or in my opinion, what's better is that healing now without damage enchants, I think they can easily afford to make it a little bit less viable, just so that when you're healing, you're doing it strategically, not because it's always the best move. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the idea of stacking strategies becoming way more prevalent. And this is a really good argument, right? I mean, if you don't have damage enchants, right, you're gonna see a lot of people not get punished as much for basically just blading a billion times or trapping a billion times, because one major way to counter that is just to enchant a bunch of hits and do a bunch of damage while they're leaving themselves open while they're blading and trapping a ton. Now, I don't think that this is entirely a good point, in the sense that right now there's one new spell that changes a lot when it comes to stacking, and that's Locust Swarm. So Locust Swarm, the way that it works, in case people didn't know, when you do get the Spellment to upgrade version of this, right? And I feel like the balanced ones should be easier to get, if I had to guess. So I think this one's actually going to be the easiest. It takes 100 damage on yourself and then does 375 damage on your opponent. But what's very important is that 100 damage is based on your opponent's school. So if someone's like trap stacking against you and going for a one-shot, there are a lot of ways to counter it, but this is a big shutout, especially if they're not doing like triple traps. If they're just doing a bunch of single traps and elemental and spirit traps or something like that, this is gonna hard counter it. You can gain several rounds on your opponent, especially if you're keeping things like brace, weakness, maybe one shield, just to make sure that they're not taking advantage of the damage. If you play smart, this gives you a huge out when it comes to trap stack. Obviously, it's a matter of getting this for a bunch of schools, but I think it's going to be one of the easier ones to get because it's balanced. Every other spellment system in this game makes balance spells easier to get. I've noticed this with Obsidian Colossus and Beast Moon. I've noticed this with a lot of spells, so I feel like that's true. So that leaves blade stacking, and yes, I think blade stacking is way powerful without Solar Surge, and there isn't as easy of a counter like Locust Swarm. But hopefully the solution to that is to use a strategy that gives you secondary school magic, right? And hopefully what the idea would be is that you can use blade removal, like, you know, something that makes blades into shields, something that maybe turns blades into traps, which I don't currently have, but that's also a nice spell. And maybe you could set up for a gambit that uses whatever you turn those blades into to set up for a very big hit. Now, that's obviously way easier said than done. There's a very real chance that blade stacking strategies are going to be a menace. I just like the fact that you don't have to worry about both blade and trap. It somewhat makes the whole problem a little bit easier to deal with. And when in doubt, you could always putrefaction. Now, keep in mind, the gambits that are surrounding blades, they have been patched. That means that, like, if you're trying to go for a Death Djinn or a Storm Scion, and you have, like, I don't know, let's say in the case of a Storm Scion, you have a Storm Blade and an Elemental Blade, right? You have the 4 blades you need to do the extra damage. What the spell does now is it basically clears the blades first, meaning you will not do a double buffed, double damage Scion with those 4 blades. You will do just a double damage Scion. So they did patch it, so it's not absolutely stupid anymore. I think the bigger issue is just going to be blade stacking for the sake of blade stacking into a bigger hit anyways. Maybe Death Djinn might be a problem. I don't know. There are certain things, but I think that problem is way more niche than the fact that healing is just way busted right now. When I did PvP last night, y'all, I know it sounds crazy, but without Solar Surge, I was deck failing a lot less. I was actually going for gambits a lot more. It was a lot more fun. I think that when you actually go for a gambit, you're rewarded. Spells that we simply could have written off until now are suddenly viable again. Like, 0 people were ever really going for a Doom Oni before, because 1,000 damage is fine at all when you have 4 shields, right? You have to work for those shields. Yeah, it's okay, But if you could enchant this, why would you ever go for 1,000 here and set up for a bunch of shields when you could just do 800 for free? So spells like Dionis, they're going to be way more important now compared to where they used to be. Now, this is probably your dominant mid-range hit compared to your other hits. And Scions that were not used before might actually be also way more valid to use. Again, Scion was not used because of Wraith as well, because you could always double Wraith for basically the same damage as the Scion, and you would literally not have to put a bunch of weaknesses on your opponent. I'm willing to give this no Solar Surge thing a chance. It's not actually known yet whether this is a permanent thing, if this is just for testing purposes. Obviously, test round, right? So we will not know until it goes in a live round. That being said, if they can somewhat make healing not completely out heal every hit ever, and also make stacking strategies not completely dominant to the point where every game is a stacking strategy, then I think we could see a very, very cool meta without Solar Surge. I hope that we don't just get bogged down like we have in the past by more repetitive things like heal spamming or blade spamming. That's my hope. But honestly, even with that, there might be some ways to adapt and evolve around it. So I'm hoping that this is actually a very good change. I'm going to be doing tons of test run content in video form, and I'm going to be covering, there's a lot more to cover, and I'm going to be doing a ton of test run PvP right here on this channel when I'm live. So make sure you drop a sub, turn on the noties, y'all, because you don't want to miss any of this. Drop a sub if you're enjoying, leave a comment, tell me what you guys think of all of this. And as always, if somebody has not told you you're awesome today, they're doing something wrong. So stay awesome, and yeah.